Nobody minds, I will share my screen and we will start talking about it. Can everybody see my screen?
Got it. Yep.
So it's exciting. This is an exciting time of year. This is where the rubber meets the road in terms of precision irrigation. We will kind of dive into some of the best practices and what to look for as the year has been different across the country, moisture-wise, kind of opposite for us. So, John, do you have anything to say before I kick into the next slide?
No, let's get going. Next slide, please. I think so today, in terms of just before we kick off, Jason, I'll let you get into the agenda a second, but before we get started here, I wanted to make sure we give a special call out to precision agronomy and especially Nick Lammers. I think Nick has forgotten more about this topic than most of us know, and has taught us a lot about just the on the ground agronomy and the realistic practicalities of scheduling that last irrigation and what a big impact it can have. So just a lot of the materials that you see here are heavily influenced by Nick and his thinking over the years. So thanks, Nick.
Yeah, can't say thanks enough to Nick. So thanks, John. Today we're going to cover how timing the last irrigation effectively can have a big impact, both on yield and energy and water savings. We're going to look at some helpful late season data checks using your CropX Moisture data and app here at the end of the season, other data and factors to consider, and we've got some case examples and pro tips. This information is relevant for a wide range of annual crops. So why is this important? Why is this topic as big as it is? And the number one is that it saves money. We're removing, in many cases, an unneeded irrigation. That's going to save money on energy and water if they pay for water. In many cases, the grower is going to save $500 to $1,000 for every irrigation event saved. John, what are your thoughts on saving money here?
Yeah, I mean, of course, you know, every field is going to be different in terms of what's the cost of electricity and wear and tear for one, you know, pivot pass, for example, has a lot to do with power source, water depth, pump capacity, so many things. But this is kind of a broad range that we've heard from folks over the years and have calculated ourselves. I've heard a lot of cases that are actually in excess of this. Jason, I think in your area, you've probably seen a lot of that too. And just when I think about, you know, the ROI and the ROI for, you know, dealers, your services to the grower, it's been interesting to hear from so many of you over the past few years about like, hey, like I can make a strong positive return on investment case for my services pretty easily sometimes just by optimizing when to turn on and when to shut off, right? And everything else, all the precision scheduling, BRI, anything else that happens in season is just, you know, added fuel to the fire, icing on the cake, if you will. So if you think about it from that perspective, like this topic is a special opportunity to provide just an outsized impact on your growers real quick by getting the timing of the last event right.
Thanks, John. Number two, we're saving soil nutrients. We all know that excessive irrigation leads to faster downward water movement. Around crop maturity, root uptake rates are often well below their peaks. This combination can lead to a window of opportunity for unwanted nitrogen waste through leaching. And then we've included an example, 10 pounds an acre savings is worth about $800 over a quarter section. So on top of being able to alert, you know, and now that we have the new feature where we can alert for nitrogen leaching, we're saving just based on the irrigation as well. So John, you want to say a little bit about,
Yeah, and Jason, was it like a week or two ago that you touched on the leaching feature also in a webinar?
yeah, I think it was about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, about 2 weeks ago. So yeah, anyway, that's the leaching tracker, and I think that can come into play here, especially, like having those conversations around, well, look, we were successful towards the end of the season preventing leaching, and we've got proof positive. You can see it right here in the data. But anyway, this cost savings on nitrogen topic, I think this one is interesting just to run the numbers for example fields. And of course, your nitrogen prices are local and those are going up and down all the time. But just like taking some average prices of UAN here from our territory and considering basically a full pivot, you're pushing $1,000 already. And I think from a grower perspective, they don't often think about it that way. But look, if you can reduce that loss and it ends up in a late season or a postseason nitrogen test, you're in a place that can get some carryover over the winter, which a lot of places and a lot of soils that can happen. That's real savings. That's real money that you can bank into the next year. By the way, that 10 pounds per excess turn is not a magic number. There's kind of a range around there depending on soils and crop conditions and all kinds of stuff. I've seen a few different studies, but that's a pretty fair and realistic rule of thumb. On that window of opportunity, I've seen a bunch of studies on this. Like groups will go in and use monitoring data to figure out when nitrogen loss is happening throughout the year. And I can tell you, like early spring around planting time, and here at end of season and wet conditions are the big windows that you often see time and time again.
Yeah, so looking at next year, looking at carryover, that's just more ROI. Fewer harvest delays is number 3, and what we're talking about is not having a wet field. As much as anything, we can reduce compaction. We can reduce those harvest windows can be very narrow. We can reduce the risk of missing those and unnecessary slowing of dry down, so we can get in there when we need to get in there. John, thoughts on harvest delays?
Nope, I think you hit it.
Number 4 is helping soil quality. So here it is, less compaction during harvest due to wet soils. I can't tell you how much we lose in my area if we do catch a rain late and we have those high traffic areas. In turn, it helps preserve soil structure, water holding capacity, moisture retention, all those things we're working on improving in an effort to improve our yield.
Yeah, and Jason, I think everybody here has probably seen it, just having to do machinery passes in wet conditions and what that can cause. But to me, it's interesting and kind of counterintuitive in some way that too wet conditions can lead to less water storage over time, and it's through that compaction. So that's a weird one. It's like too wet leads to reduced water storage. The reason is because when you compact, of course you reduce your porosity, the amount of space that's in the soil to hold water. And over time and with enough wear and tear on a abused field, that can really affect water management. I think we've heard a lot of good examples over time on that one too.
So quick summary, just keeping your soil moisture in check around harvest makes great agronomic sense, and the ROI is there for your growers, both this year and next year. I mean, some of this is looking forward, reducing compaction, reducing leaching, setting ourselves up for a good season next year.
Maybe question here for Jason, you or maybe Stahl or Emmanuel, anybody that wants to weigh in terms of how this plays in a wet year versus a dry year versus an average year. I'm curious about thinking there? Is it more valuable in one climatic type or the other?
Stahl, you want to chime in?
Hmm. I was going to chime in earlier and just say I think that's probably one of the biggest points, is because I've seen those 2 or 3 inch rain weeks that we get in October, and that doesn't bode well for your harvest timing. And not only are you preventing the compaction, but it's probably even more important for you to get back into the field quicker. And we all know how stretched out some farmers are with the amount of acres they're trying to cover, and sitting that extra 2 or 3 days may make the difference between you getting it out at the right time or the wrong time.
Nick
that-
Emanuel, do you have any personal experience here?
I don't see him in here, and I don't have him added as a panelist if he is, but so.
No sweat. I deferred to you, Stahl, because to be honest, this is the first wet year we've had in a long time, so I thought we'd lean on your knowledge there. So we're gonna go dive into data checks, our late season data checks, things you should be keeping an eye on, and certainly you can use the CropX platform to do so. Keep an eye on crop progress and expected maturity dates. The next slide will have some tips on that. Check to make sure the full and refill lines are in good shape. Also, consider downward adjustment of refill during maturity, depending on your conditions. And actually, I'd like to stop there. John, if you don't mind, will you give us a little more detail on downward adjustment of refill?
Well, this is an interesting one. I think for, experienced dealers, I have seen, just looking at the data from our side, I have seen people do this as a practice, basically around maturity time, push down your refill line as a percentage of your full line. And the rationale there is that, what we typically consider as stress conditions for the rest of the season that you never want to get close to, never you want to get into, that can be an appropriate range for dry down. And so I have seen folks do this a lot, and I've heard that it can be very effective. Agronomically, every crop has their growth stages or parts of their growth cycle that is more sensitive to water stress and water availability than others. And so, like, corn's the one that I know best, so I use a bunch of corn examples, but I think a lot of us know that around tasseling time is a time that you really, really want to be conservative and not mess with any sort of chance of water stress, because that can be very damaging to the yield outcomes. But we'll show it here in a second. But once you get into those late reproductive stages, the water stress risk very quickly goes away. So anyway, we just wanted to mention this as an opportunity because it's a practice that a lot of folks do. However, we also know the flip side of the coin, right? It's you want to be sure about it because you don't want to accidentally sort of risk getting somebody into stress conditions. And there's that kind of biological consideration, and also just in terms of communication with growers. I have heard from several dealers kind of encouraging growers to follow them on a practice like this, and getting like, a worried look. And so sometimes it just may not be realistically possible. Maybe like in the first year of a relationship or so, maybe it's something that you got to build towards. But anyway, I think it's optional, but it can be really useful and something to consider depending on your grower relationship, the field, and so on.
John, would you say that adjustments made based on experience, or is there a resource, is there a graph I can go to somewhere?
There are some rule of thumbs. Personally, I don't like to show them on a slide like this because they do vary by soil type, Jason. So, you know, we've like Nick Lammers has got some examples based on, you know, loamy soils, silty soils. I've seen some other studies from University of Nebraska, Texas A&M, and others that have some other rules of thumb. So first of all, keep in mind your soil type and your crop type, of course, when you go look for resources. I would also say, you know, like we've got a lot of materials here at CropX. So if this is something you're interested in and you want a deeper agronomic conversation, give us a call or email to support. We'll get you hooked up with the best resources we can find. But the other one is just like you know, keeping an eye on the graphs, and we got some graph examples here later. I understand that Stahl might have a fresh example or two that we'll be pulling up, but you know, you can use kind of the time view of the graphs to weigh into this, taking a look at your stepping conditions, for example. And you know, all those are resources to help you decide on this in real time.
Great, thanks, John. Also, you know, it's important to check the active root zone depth. So we're recommending you may want to set up the root zone graph versus the profile sum, especially if all the activity is above that bottom sensor. So if you're seeing everything above the bottom sensor, it's important to think about where the crop can actually uptake moisture and nutrients from. So as promised, how to predict maturity dates. And you should know, I think it's the first thing you should know is we do offer the accumulated GDD option there in the crop status card. But for sure, scouting, consulting with your grower, checking the accumulated GDD versus what that crop takes to reach maturity. And also forecasts from, you know, a trusted local source, university extension websites, but try to make sure that that data is as specific to the current year as possible. John, I know you have some thoughts on predicting maturity dates if you want to
Well, yeah, because I used to work on it a bunch as a scientist, and I think maybe my main punchline on this is it is an inexact science, because you know the relationships between GDD and maturity do vary according to genetics a little bit. So you know, there's new hybrids coming out every year, and so you get some variability there. Of course, the big factor is, you know, nobody can forecast the air temperatures 1 month out, and that's often the time range that we're talking about here. So that's going to add some fuzziness to the predictions sometimes. So anyway, you know, there's a lot of good resources out there that use the real weather data up to the current day, plus basically historical normals, averages, or 75th percentiles or so based on the last 30 years. A lot of university extension agents have a web tool like that. UNL does it for the Nebraska folks here. So that's a good resource. But I would say overall, just like, you know, keep in contact with your grower or any other agronomists that they're working with, because they're going to be, you know, helping you forecast based on past experience.
And John, just for my own sake, the CropX GDD is based on real weather. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. So, you know, for those of you that have a weather station connected up to CropX, it's going to use the weather data off of that. Otherwise, it's going to use our gridded data, which, you know, I know everybody like scrutinizes the gridded weather data, and it's never a perfect estimate. But I can tell you that temperature for the most part for those is pretty good in my experience, and better than rainfall, for example. So I would say on the whole that the GDD accumulations based on gridded weather data are decent and should get you in, like, at a very quick automated way, get you in the right ballpark CropX does run crop models. Okay, so for every crop type that you enter for a field, we're gonna use the correct coefficients for the crop type to accumulate those GDDs based on the air temperature. So hopefully that's a convenient way to start. And of course, you know, a lot of you work with data on GDD to maturity. So just comparing the accumulated GDD versus the number you've got from the planted seed on GDD maturity. It's good cross reference.
Thanks, John. I can stop here. It looks like we may have a question or two. Stoll, do you have those?
Yeah, there was a few submitted in the Q&A, and I went ahead and answered
Oh,
the main
perfect.
one. So everybody should see the first answer related to profile root zone sums. Sorry, root zone sums.
And Stahl, anything to add from your experience on just how you would coach folks to get best estimates of future maturity dates?
Mainly just grower communication, getting current staging from the growers.
Yep,
Is
sounds good.
another way.
We'll move on. So it's important to plan in advance, kind of what a good segue and planning in advance of crop maturity. You want to make a plan to get your root zone moisture sum to be fairly dry. This goes back to possibly adjusting that line around refill versus around full. Don't wait till the last few days to plan. Keep in mind, it may take some time to achieve the moisture conditions that you want. And why? Soils with a good water holding capacity and moisture sitting at full field capacity can take days or weeks to dry down depending on the conditions. The crop's water demands declines as it approaches maturity. This means soil water depletion rates can be slower than compared to mid-season. And remember, rainfall can push you in the other direction. The moisture forecast that's available on the profile sum takes 7-day rainfall forecast into account. So if you see that line going up, it's important to know there's rain in the forecast. John?
Yeah, for me, Jason, this is almost like the main point of the topic or the main slide. It's like if we can get one suggestion over to you in this hour, it's think ahead on this, because if you're really like, you know, days from maturity and you're in a place with a good water holding capacity and you've been able to stay around the full line in the run up, you may find yourself out of time to execute on this and it may be too late. You know, I think for a lot of people, you know, I know there's a lot of experienced folks in there where we're preaching to the choir already, but probably especially for your growers and your grower communications for new dealers. It's not intuitive, and it's a big aha moment, I think, for a lot of folks, that for a lot of soil conditions, it takes a long time to achieve this. And so you got to start early. The next slide's got some numbers to make this a little bit more concrete, but you know, when you're trying to dry the soil down, rainfall's fighting against you. Your water holding capacity is fighting against you. It's almost like the opposite of the mindset of the rest of the season. So it's kind of a shift.
I think we'll go to the next slide. I had a question for you, John, but I think it's going to be answered here. So the example, of course, is Nebraska corn averages. The average is 5 inches of uptake needed in the last 34 days of physiological development. So R4 to black layer. I guess let's start right there. John, would you say is R4 the point where we should start back in that Backing that line down toward refill?
Well, no, not, this is just an example, and definitely not always. I think, you know, I've got a kind of a caution on the bottom left of the slide here that this is just a case study, and every field and every region is different. So don't use these numbers for your field. This is just kind of like I think a kind of an eye opener example that's interesting and helps make it concrete is all. But so this one is from Nick Lammer's materials. So Nick, thanks again for these. And I found this one particularly interesting. So if you look at what's highlighted here on the right-hand side in that red square, and you look at the approximate days to maturity, again, based on long-term averages, every year is different. This is not a magic number, but just long-term average for Nebraska corn, about 34 days to maturity once you hit R4. Okay. So that's a long time. You know, that's a significant percentage of the season if you think about it. And then you look at the total uptake needed over that period based on the studies that the university has done, and it's just around 5 inches after you hit R4 to take you all the way through to physiological maturity, which in corn is black layer. And then so then there's a number, about 5 inches of total uptake for that part of the season. As you can see, you know, compare that with the mid-season. This is a lot lower uptake rate when you hit late maturity stages. That's just, the plant needs less at that time of the year. So all of that 1 month totaled up just 5 inches of uptake needed. Now, let's go away from the crop thinking for a second and go over to the soil side and compare this with a soil water holding capacity. Again, we're just taking an example. Every single field is different. You need to be using data and soil sensors to do this on a field by field basis. But again, just for argument's sake, suppose you got a good silty loam or a silty clay loam, high water holding capacity, and suppose that you've got an active root depth around 2 feet. You run the quick numbers on that, and that works out to, you know, about 6 inches or so of plant available water just sitting there when you're at field capacity. That right there, without any more irrigation or rain, is more than you need in order to achieve the water uptake for the whole rest of the season. That's very interesting to me, and I think is in this case is kind of an eye opener of, you know, if you find yourself in a situation like this, how early you should be thinking in advance of maturity, like it's more than a month out in this case. The last data point here on that yield impact is, you know, there have been a bunch of studies from this same area in conditions like this, where, you know, you've been able to keep around the full line in the mid-season, and then you enter the late season and you do a strategy like this, an aggressive cutback on water. There's a lot of studies confirming that there have been no impact on yield in a situation like this. And I think some people will read that study and be like, well, really? Like, what? How? Why? How is that possible? That seems magical. But this is the reason. These are the numbers why that happens. I want to throw out a couple counter examples though, just to emphasize the fact that this does, like, you need to manage your field and not to averages. Nick Emanuel was telling me about a situation where, you know, he was going for some high yield corn, and he wasn't at field capacity going into the late season, and he went ahead and invested in some late season irrigation events to maintain soil water status longer. And it was a difference maker for him. He was able to get a big yield pop and a big ROI on that water. The difference from that case that Nick was describing and this case is all about where you're at in that soil profile. So he was not at full in those cases, and by topping up, he was able to have some yield success. So again, cases vary, but in a situation like this, this is a good illustration just how much you can cut back, but how early you need to be thinking about it in order to do that.
Thanks, John. I think through all that, what we heard was, this is not an exact science. Every field's different. What can come in handy, what will come in handy is having a sensor in every field. I think that's what my takeaway there.
Yep, there you go. You need to be using data rather than averages. And that's, that's the value you provide. That's the value of the sensor and the agronomic insight. So
So here's an example of some calculations. I might actually let Nick Stahl kind of narrate this graph just because he's more of an expert than I am. Nick, you want to touch on this screen here?
Yeah, I've got some live examples that we'll go through. If you want me to do that, or if you want to finish up these slides and then I can do that, that's your call.
If this looks like what you're going to talk about, let's do it now and let's work it in.
Okay.
I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Got the graph on this end?
Yes.
Cool. I brought up this example first and foremost because I think it's always nice to start off with what you're really striving for. And this is a really good poster child example of how we coach a crop season to go, how your profile should be throughout a whole year. And the reason we say that is early season, we were allowing for root development. We essentially maintained soil moisture throughout the early reproductive cycles. And then kind of in the middle of the reproductive cycles, we were maintaining moisture. And then at the end, we were trying to work that profile down. And as John and Jason were saying, when it comes to trying to end here when maturity comes, it's not something that can happen all at once. In other words, if you wait until the second or third week of August, or we'll say 30 days for maturity, to start your action plan, it's too late because you're probably going to end somewhere around here. You kind of have to plan ahead and essentially work that profile down over time, because one of the other strategies that I've become more sensitive to, I guess you could say, is making sure that we don't go more than, one way to think of it is maybe not going more than 7 to 10 days without any water, especially once you get to maturity, because I think there's some validity to saying the plants kind of get lazy, if you will. And so you want to make sure that that top 8 to 12 inches stays active and continuing to pump nutrients into those roots. So that likely means that you can't go from here all the way to here without some sort of added water. But what that does mean is that you kind of have to plan in between each irrigation for, maybe utilizing 2 to 3 days of additional profile moisture before the next event. So essentially, we ended here, and then before the next event, we ended here, and then the next event, we ended here, and then the next event, we ended a little bit lower than that. So we have this downward trend that we're working toward these last 30 to 40 days of the season. So that's the best way to manage it that I've found. So now that we've seen the poster child, let's look at another example. So another, this example here, I think, is one that, we did an okay job on. The thing I wanted to point out was how much later this event occurred in terms of the calendar, even though this is in the same region and the same crop. So this last irrigation was September 10th. And that previous field, I think it was August 25th or something like that. Yeah, 23rd. So big difference in how we were managing the water in that last irrigation, but it's still the same crop. And another trend, I guess I could say, that we've seen in the last several years is, especially with long maturity hybrids, that they really do keep chugging along late in the season. Now, this was essentially using water pretty similar to the way it was using water in late July and early August. And that's going to be really weather dependent too, because your days are so much shorter. You've got to have temps in September in the 80s and 90s probably to produce that kind of reaction. But in any case, it was utilizing that water that was there, and so that's an important thing to watch out for too. So just staying on top of the maturities. A lot of times we might get a grower saying, "Oh, it's at third milk line," and then it takes forever for it to get to half or 3/4 milk line. I don't know if it's just some hybrids or what, but they seem to really be pumping lots of weight into those kernels in some cases.
Nick, I'm sorry, I have a question on your first slide.
Sure.
In like around August 10th there, the refill line seems to go down. Was that one of the manual adjustments we were suggesting was a good strategy earlier?
Yes, good call out. And just to like show you how hopefully consistent our timing is, today is August 10th, and this was this is a graph from 2022. We moved this refill line on August 10th. So we are doing this webinar on the right date for you to start to take action. So, but yes, good call out. We did that there. And then I've got my last example is from this year and adjusting that refill line.
I've got a question. Maybe this is more for the dealers, and I encourage anybody that wants to answer this to just put a little chat in the group chat here on the Zoom. This question's on the communication side. For those of you that do implement strategies like this for the last irrigation, dry down for the last irrigation, what are some ways that you've found to be effective communicating this and explaining the value of this to your growers? Anybody that wants to write in, I'd appreciate it. Just be curious to hear what's working for you on that side.
Yep, good call out. For me, text message is probably my number one. And that can be part of your regular recommendation communication as well, and getting some sort of feedback on maturity. Nothing I've seen through the messages yet. We'll come back and see if we get any other input. This example here, also wanted to bring up because I think you can see we're managing it a little bit differently, and that is because one, this is a very sandy soil, and so we really, like John said, we don't necessarily have the luxury in this case to manage that refill line a lot lower compared to a heavier soil where there's more water holding capacity. So that's point number one on here. Point number two, this was soybeans. And so you'll be wanting to make sure that that top foot and a half has got enough available water to continue to supply that plant all the way to senescence, which can happen, which water use can happen pretty well up to the very, very end. And we can see that here. In fact, I had to kind of convince the grower, we really do need to irrigate on September 29th, which is very late. But I think you can see that the plants really did indeed utilize that water that we applied. In fact, even a little bit more. And I'm not sure, I may have to go back, but maybe it finally froze on October 8th. That's why it finally stopped. So another good example of how things can be a little bit different from one field to the other. So 2020 is or I'm sorry, hindsight is 2020, right? So those were all examples from the previous year. So let's look at an example from this year. And this is in corn. So again, I think they're doing an excellent job of sticking to our overall strategy. So far, we had good root development early in the season, kind of maintaining our moisture. We actually kind of increased it a bit through the early reproductive cycles, but now it's time to start thinking about maturity. So we've moved the refill line down a bit, and I will likely target our next irrigation somewhere around here. So that'll give us about 3 days of water use below our previous, this was not an irrigation, this was actually some rain yesterday morning. So that likely gives us about, it's going to be about 4 days of water use before we get back to that same level, plus an additional 3 or 4 that we want to utilize of that subsoil moisture. So it's going to be 7 to 8 days before we even need to worry about irrigating again. And then after that, we'll probably be able to make that final push to that refill line. You know, again, waiting another likely 5 to 7 days. Few other comments here. One from Matt, because we started off so dry in much of the Corn Belt, especially in Nebraska, that if you haven't had the luxury of some rains or a well that's capable of building profile moisture, you may not be able to count on your ability to utilize that subsoil moisture late in the season if you never were able to build that moisture to begin with. So in other words, if you started dry and you're at or below the same level you were at the very beginning, then you may not have much to work with this last 3 or 4 weeks. So it is more about just maintaining your moisture rather than trying to aim even drier because you're already dry. Another question about the rooting depth in the soybean example. We can take a look at that here. Most of the time when you're irrigating to these strategies and you're following them, you can pretty well hit those deep root activity. So in this case, we've got roots well into the 2nd and 3rd foot. I'm looking at a huge time frame here, so it's kind of hard to see it on the stacked version. And this is only going back to August, but you can see we've got roots here in the late part of August. Those are the examples I wanted to go through. Anything else you guys need to add, Jason or John?
No, it's great. Thanks for the examples, Nick. I was going to ask you about those soil types, but I think you covered it. The first one you showed was heavier soil, and then the second one was on the sandy side.
Actually, both the first and the second were fairly heavy soils. This one was just lower profile sums because this is one of the V2 sensors.
Okay, got it.
The third one is a pretty sandy soil, the soybeans.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. And then this last one is kind of a mix, probably a sandy loam or a loam.
So just as a time check, I think we got about 10 minutes left. Jason, you want to take us home?
Yeah, thanks for that, Nick. That really brought everything we've been talking about home. So, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, some pro tips. The higher the soil water holding capacity, the earlier you should plan for dry down. I think we've kind of got to that point, but it just makes good sense. Always coordinate and communicate your plan with your grower. Let them know what you're doing and what you're thinking and why. Even with a great plan, you gotta watch the data, continue to monitor and adjust anything based on what you're seeing. And afterwards, take advantage of the CropX tools for post-season grower conversations about ROI, season summary reports, machine data import for yield visualization, and leaching records. All very handy tools. John, anything there you want to talk about?
Oh no, all good points. I got plenty to say on the postseason discussions, but probably deserves its own webinar at some point. So I hope we're one of these days we'll be able to get one offered for all of you. Really focusing on that postseason retrospective, looking at the data, talking ROI. For me, it's a great one as you go into your year-on-year, retention and growth plans with your growers. That's all I've got to add.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, John. In terms of value to our dealers, that may be very high on the list. So thanks for coming, everybody. I appreciate you guys taking time out of your morning. I know it's a busy time of year. Thank you, Nick and John and everyone else who chimed in. John, do you have anything to say on the last Q&A slide here?
No, I'm good. Likewise. Yeah, busy time. I really appreciate everybody coming. This is, not a intro topic, not a one-on-one topic so if we've got any first year dealers in the audience that are interested in this topic, we piqued your interest, you see the value, but you need a deeper discussion. Don't hesitate, get in touch and we can talk you through. We can look at some examples from your own business. Happy to help how we can. Thanks all.
We'll add one little housekeeping thing for everybody. We are posting these webinars on the help.cropx.com site. In fact, all of the invitations you receive have the links to the previous webinar. But here's the site. It's pretty easy to find. You can search for the topic you're looking for, and this is not, of course, only just webinars, but all of our knowledge-based content is all here. So here's all of the version or the webinars we've done so far this season.
Perfect. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everybody. If anyone has any questions, shout them out now and we'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, our technical support team is always available for you.
Yep. Have a good day.